Okay, it looks like it's a little past 9. We're still missing Dr. Toma, but we're going to go ahead and start. We've got a few things to take care of before the meeting gets started, before Greg and him start presenting. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to the CFG meeting. As you know, today's group will be adopting the final revision for fiscal year 24 and adopting the official estimates for fiscal year 25 and 26. Before we start, there's one housekeeping issue that we need to take care of. With the unfortunate passing of Dr. O'Connor, the CFG is now without a chair. So at this time, I'll entertain motions for nominations for the chair of the CFG. Dr. Bollinger.
I nominate Bruce Johnson.
Okay. All right. So we have nominations for Dr. Johnson. So moved. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none. Hearing none. Is there a motion for the nominations to cease? So moved. Okay. So all those in favor of approving Dr. Johnson, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. Is my mic working? Those opposed, say nay. Congratulations, Dr. Johnson, on being approved as CFG chair.
Well, thank you. As you may recall, when John Runkers sent out the email proposing this, I had a condition which we would like to have a vice chair. I know, for instance, that should we be called back into for a meeting in the first part of 2025, if we need to revise our forecast, I'll be out of the country for 3.5 months. And so I thought John Perry will do anything I ask him to do. So I asked John if he'd be willing. And so I guess I nominate John Perry as vice chair if for some reason I'm not able to come to a meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All right.
Sounds like a great idea to me.
All right. So all those in favor of John Perry as vice chair?
Aye.
Okay. All right. Congratulations, Mr. Vice Chair. I think now with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, we'll turn it over to the staff.
Thank you all for your continued service to the Commonwealth through your CFG membership. If it pleases the chair, we're probably going to do the same strategy we've been doing. We'll go through the U.S. Economic forecast with the control optimistic, pessimistic. Then we'll run through the Kentucky model, the MAC model we call it, that feeds off the U.S. outlook, and then we'll go through the general fund estimates, control optimistic, pessimistic, then the road fund. Control optimistic, pessimistic, and then we'll conclude with the master settlement agreement presentation and confirmation of the estimate. We're mindful that some folks have afternoon conflicts, so we'll try to mind our pace. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Michael Jones to begin the economic outlook.
Well, good morning. Again, mindful of your time, I'm going to go through this rather quickly, but if there's anything that comes up, please do not hesitate to ask questions. So in this most recent forecast, we have had a control scenario weighted at 55%. That is the same as last presentation in September. However, S&P Global has revised their GDP estimates after the first quarter of fiscal 24 came in at 4.9%. Now, while compared to recent history, that is a blistering pace. They were expecting 5.2%. So they looked at not only the fact that it came in slightly lower than what they were expecting, it was the makeup of the GDP that concerned them. final goods sales were lower than expected. Inventories were higher than they expected, which they view as being a sign that future GDP growth is probably going to be slower than expected. So they have revised their real GDP growth rate for fiscal 24 to 2.4% in the current forecast. That compares to 1.9% that was presented last time. Overall, they're expecting below trend growth in fiscal 25 and 26. The strong growth that we have seen in manufacturing facilities due to the incentives under the CHIPS Act is expected to have peaked and start to slowly drop off. And since we last met, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics have both issued revisions. Now, the BEA's revisions go back significantly. The personal income components have been revised all the way back to the first quarter of 1979. But more germane to our discussions is the change to the national accounts, revised now back to the first quarter of calendar 13. And for our purposes here, the average growth rate from 2017 to 2022 has been revised up by 0.1% to an average of 2.2%. So the BLS statistics also gave a slight increase in the overall numbers of hours worked, which resulted in approximately a 0.5% increase in the employment figures. So overall, we've had revisions up across most categories. Now, there's a lot of detail, as you might imagine, when they revise the national accounts. The only other thing I'll add for our purposes is, as we go through, all real variables have now been benchmarked to 2017. When we presented last time in September, they were benchmarked to 2013. So there has been a upward shift in both time, and in many cases, the history would no longer match. So most of the variables I'm going to show you, I am not going to show you the history as we presented it last time. However, some of my coworkers, when they show you their variables, they may have the history. So if you see histories that look like they do not match, that is the reason why, the BEA account adjustments. My microphone's not working?
It's not picking you up. Just move it closer.
Sure thing. Usually that's not an issue. So, all right, sorry about that. And I need reading glasses to see notes. So unfortunately, that is the case. So, I'm sorry? Yes, exactly. So, other assumptions in the control scenario, the Federal Reserve, they're expecting them to peak out in the current rate hiking cycle. That'll be by the end of fiscal 24, second quarter of fiscal 24, excuse me. And they expect a reversal of policy. Now, not necessarily lowering rates, but certainly an overall slowdown in the in the balance sheet adjustments and possible rate reductions if needed in the future. But that fiscal year 24 second quarter mark is supposed to be the high water mark for the federal funds rate. Payroll growth has been moderating. We just a few minutes ago saw that the November employment report came in at 199,000, with October's being 180,000. So again, growth, but slower growth than what we have observed over the last year. And they have significant changes in the overall nominal consumption of gasoline and oil. Specifically, for fiscal 25, a 6.5% decline in consumption versus the previous forecast is positive 0.1%. And in 26, a negative 2.8% decline compared to fiscal 24. Compared to fiscal 25 versus the positive 3.4% growth that was forecasted last time. So overall, you will see as we go through the slides that many of the variables have significant changes in the near term, less changes in the out term, and we'll notice that as we go through. Now, in the optimistic scenario, the percentage here has been reduced to 15%. Well, that means obviously if control is the same and optimism has gone down, we will see that pessimism has gone up. But overall, the optimistic scenario contains essentially the same assumptions, the base assumptions we talked about last time. Stronger growth compared to the control scenario, trend growth rather than below trend growth in fiscal 25 and 26. We would expect the employment to increase by 1.7% in fiscal 25 versus the 1.5% in the in the control scenario. Real personal income growth stronger at 2.1% versus 1.7%. And most important of all of the assumptions in my mind for Kentucky is that forecast for light vehicle sales. 6% growth in fiscal 24 versus 5.3% in the control scenario, and 10% growth in fiscal 25 versus 5% growth in the control scenario. So significant growth in the optimistic scenario for light vehicle production. And of course, most importantly in the optimistic scenario, cessation of violence and fighting in Russia and Ukraine, and a quick resolution to the Middle East conflict. Unfortunately, I think I said that last time, and it seems like quick solutions to violent conflicts do not seem to be forthcoming overall. Now, the pessimistic scenario is weighted higher this time at 30%, and it does forecast for the first time a shallow recession to begin in fiscal 24 quarter 3. This is the first time we've had a shallow recession forecasted in our 2 meetings, and the first time S&P Global has had that in their forecast if you go back from August through each month up until now. GDP growth declining to 1.9% in fiscal 24 and 0.3% in fiscal 25. That recession dip, it does not bring any of the fiscal years into negative territory. It's just 2 quarters of negative growth in the meantime. That compares to 2.4% and 1% in the control scenario. Again, major reasons being concerned that the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues to expand, Middle East possibly spilling over into other areas in the region, and banking sector issues, just the same as last time, the underlying reasons. Consumer spending growth slows to 2.3% in fiscal 24 and 0.8% in fiscal 25. That's versus 2.7 and 1.6 in the control scenario. So by the time you get to fiscal 25, half the growth expected compared to the control scenario. Non-farm employment declining 1.5%, and manufacturing employment decreasing 6.1% in fiscal 25. That is versus a positive 0.1% for non-farm employment in the control scenario, and a decline of 3% in manufacturing in the control scenario. So again, fiscal 25 almost double what we see in the control scenario. Unemployment rate spikes up to 6.3% by the end of the second quarter of fiscal 25. That's versus 4.5% in the control scenario. And the Russia-Ukraine conflict drives Brent oil prices back over 110, specifically 112 in the forecast. But again, that's significantly higher than the $82 approximately that is in the control forecast. So again, I'll try to move through the slides very quickly because I know we have a time crunch, but here is the real GDP, again, chain 2017 dollars. As an aside, just real quick, if I had put the historical data up from last time, you can see that our graph here in fiscal 06 starts at $16 trillion. You would not reach $16 trillion until FY12 using the 2012 chain dollars. But under the 2017 dollars, we have the entire series above the $16 trillion mark. So a significant shift up. 0.1% of a very large economy is a large amount, but it sounds like a small change, but it actually is fairly significant. And you can see in that optimistic scenario versus the control and the pessimistic, that trend growth in the optimistic versus the moderate growth in the control scenario, and the slight decline in the pessimistic scenario with then resuming below trend growth. Here's each of the fiscal years broken out. Again, in that pessimistic scenario, a significant decline, that 1.9% in fiscal 24 versus the 2.4 in the control, but dropping all the way down to 0.3% in fiscal 25 before resuming closer to control growth in fiscal 26. Now, we also have included a slide for each major variable showing you what the presentation was in September versus December. Now, the BEA adjustments, of course, have occurred here, but this is the growth rates. So that's why history is not going to look the same on 23, but overall, 24, 25, and 26, you can make a meaningful comparison. And you can see in the control scenario that 2.4% in fiscal 24 versus the 1.9 presented last time, a little bit more of a pullback to 1% in 25, and almost identical 1.5 and 1.6% growth in the fiscal 26. Here's our employment for non-farm payrolls. Again, the optimistic and control either are constant or slight increase, but you can see in that pessimistic scenario a decline in overall non-farm payrolls. Specifically, again, the pessimistic scenario actually going negative, 1.5% decline in 25 versus the 0.2% in the optimistic and 0.1 in the control. And then in the out year, anytime I have to go to two decimal places, you know they were close. The 0.2% approximate growth in both the control and optimistic versus the decline in fiscal 26 of 0.2%. Comparing that to last time, you can see slight change in fiscal 24, a reversal of fortune in 25 and 26. Previously forecasted slight negatives, now slight positives in the control forecast for fiscal 25 and 26. Now, manufacturing is definitely a different story. You can clearly see that pessimistic scenario, how strong the decline in manufacturing will be. Now, overall, I must say, in the data, manufacturing concerning vehicles has been a positive. We have seen positive growth in the most recent data when you take manufacturing of vehicles and analyze just that factor. Overall, manufacturing, excluding vehicles, has declined, industrial production, if you will, and of course manufacturing being a derived demand. For the individuals employed in manufacturing, we've seen manufacturing decline by 0.2% in the most recent quarter when you do not include motor vehicles. Now, there's also the adjustment that was made here for the cessation of the UAW strike. So that is included here, but obviously going forward, those individuals are assumed to be working. Strike has been finished. So here's our manufacturing forecast. Again, all scenarios for fiscal 25 and 26 are negative. It's just a question of what will be the overall decline. Now, this again is U.S. manufacturing. This is not Kentucky manufacturing. We'll talk about that when we get to the slides where we compare U.S. versus Kentucky forecast. Compared to last time, again, more optimistic in the near term, positive 0.2% for fiscal 24 versus a previously forecasted decline of 0.5%, but again, negatives in each of the outgoing years and more negative off of the current base in fiscal 25 and 26 in the control forecast. Real personal income, similar story. That pessimism, we see essentially a moderation before we resume trend level growth, and you can see that the optimistic and the control scenarios are very, very similar. Overall, you can see the pessimistic scenario 1.2, 1.4 before again resuming strong growth out in 26, whereas you can see how close the forecasts are in 26 compared to the forecasted changes in 24 and 25, and there's numerous variables that have this pattern. So again, the current control forecast of 1.7 and 2.8, but essentially the optimistic and the control are identical once you get to 26. Compared to last time, slightly less growth in the near term. Again, had to go to two decimal places to make sure that you can see the difference, but stronger growth in the current forecast for both 25 and 26 with 2.8% growth in each fiscal year in the current forecast. Now, wage and salary disbursements, again, much like personal income, the control and the optimistic forecast are almost identical, and again, with pessimistic having a slightly moderated before returning to a slower but positive growth in the out year. You can see that the control scenario goes from 5.4 to 3.8 to 3.9 as compared to the pessimistic forecast with 4.8% in the current year with a 1.7 and 2.9% growth in fiscal 26. And compared to last time, slightly more positive in the near term, slightly more negative, but almost identical in fiscal 26. Real consumer spending, there's been a lot of discussion about the resumption of student loan payments, and they certainly mentioned that in their write-up. You can see that the control scenario is essentially slightly below recent trends. The optimistic assumes the current trends continue, and then pessimistic slight decline to slight positive, but then returning back to positive growth. You can see here 2.7% growth in the near term, and then 1.6 and 1.9 in the control in the out years. Compared to last time, again, stronger growth in fiscal 24, slightly better growth in 25, and then almost identical growth compared to the previous forecast in fiscal 26. Housing starts, obviously, we've had a long discussion about this last time. The housing situation, we've seen a slight moderation in interest rates, and we've certainly seen a stagnation of people bringing inventory to the market. So we've seen a strong increase in housing starts as the existing home sales, there just hasn't been that level of inventory. And you can see that across the board in the near term, negatives with slight positive only in the optimistic scenario, and then returning to positive growth rates in fiscal 26. Compared to the previous forecast, much more negative in the near term of 4.8% decline in the control forecast compared to the 1.5% forecasted last time, and then a slight decline of 0.6% before returning to positive 3.1% versus the 0.7% forecasted last time, or presented last time. Again, existing home sales, like I said, the inventory is just not there. People feel like, why would I bring my house to market if I don't know where I'm going to move? I'm locked into a low interest rate. Why would I start to take on a higher interest rate? And you can see that in the current forecast, the growth of the median price is still positive. You would expect there to be more of a tempering in prices, but the overall demand is clearly, quantity demand is greater than the supply that's being brought to the marketplace. So in all scenarios, we see positive growth in the existing sale price. And again, compared to what was presented last time, complete reversal of what they expected. They expected a pullback in the near term of existing single-family home sales. That has now gone from a negative 1.2% decline to a positive 6.5% increase. So a significant reversal of fortune compared to last time. Again, not good for the first-time home buyer. Consumption of gasoline and oil. As I said many times before, remember in this graph, the pessimistic forecast will be the highest line because in the pessimistic forecast, world oil prices go back over $100. There's, of course, also a corresponding increase in West Texas Intermediate prices. But you can see that in the pessimistic scenario, increase in oil prices leads to a significant increase in the nominal consumption of gasoline and oil. Compared to what was presented last time, you can see, this is what I mentioned in the overall write-up, compared in fiscal 25 to a previous presentation of 0.1% growth, a decline of 6.5% growth, and again, rather than a 3.4% positive increase in fiscal 26, a decline of negative 2.8%. So essentially, a over 6% swing compared to what was presented last time. So clearly, lower oil prices are expected in the control forecast. I mentioned before the unit sales of light vehicles. That optimistic line, that is a shockingly large amount of growth in the sale of light vehicles. We've seen numerous reports of manufacturers starting to slow down the production of electric vehicles, but electrical vehicles essentially make up approximately 10% of new car sales. The vast majority of new car sales are still traditional light vehicles. This also includes light trucks. And we can see that in both the control and the optimistic scenario, there is fairly strong growth, as opposed to the pessimistic scenario where we do see a near-term decline. Again, I mentioned the difference between the control scenario, 5.3 and 5% growth in fiscal 24 and 25 versus 6 and 10% growth respectively in the optimistic. That optimistic scenario is a extremely strong amount of growth in the sale of light vehicles, as opposed to the pessimistic scenario with a relatively moderate growth and a decline in fiscal 26. As compared to last time, almost no change in the control scenario. It really is a much more of a movement in that optimistic scenario. Real exports of goods and services. Again, you can see that the control and the optimistic forecast have continuing strong growth, whereas there's a slight moderation in the pessimistic forecast. Compared to last time, almost no difference in fiscal 24, but we do see a slight moderation in 25 and 26. And again, not surprising because whereas S&P Global had expected final sales of net exports to be a positive gain for our most recent GDP report, it actually was a slight decrease in the overall contribution to growth. So they have certainly moderated their forecast going forward. And real exports of motor vehicles and parts, obviously an important area for Kentucky. We can see that in all the scenarios we're expecting declines. It's just a question of how much the export of motor vehicle and parts declines relative to the very strong increase you can see in the most recent history from the end of the COVID pandemic to now. Compared to what was presented last time, you can see that the current forecast has a more moderate decline in the near term of negative 1.3% versus the 4.6% that was expected last time. But in fiscal 25, the control scenario has a decline of 11.6% in exported motor vehicles and parts. Compared to the 5.2% decline that was forecasted last time. And then you can see slight moderation of only a 1.6% decline in fiscal 26 versus the previously presented 2.8%. So I know I went through that quite quickly, but if anyone has any questions, I'll certainly loop back. Hearing none, I will move on to the Kentucky economic outlook. So here we have the Kentucky non-farm employment, and again, much like in the national forecast, you can see that we have a control forecast that has relatively consistent but lackluster growth. The optimistic scenario has a slight increase in the near term, followed by back to slightly less than old trend growth, and then the pessimistic, we have a decline in the overall non-farm employment. You can see here, you can see that pessimistic forecast, that minus 1.4 is pretty strongly pessimistic compared to the very slightly positive 0.2% and the optimistic scenario 0.2% for fiscal 25. And then we have almost identical growth forecasted in the control and optimistic scenario in 26, but a slight decline, 0.2% in fiscal 26. Now here we compare U.S. versus Kentucky, and we do have an unusual situation. In fiscal 24, we do have growth in Kentucky higher, 1.7% versus 1.5%. Now, breaking this down into the components, you can see that in the U.S. versus the Kentucky forecast, Kentucky is expected to have stronger growth in both the construction and manufacturing sector. Given the amount of construction we've seen with the recent plant construction that has been occurring in the Commonwealth, especially down towards Elizabethtown and western Kentucky, that's not too surprising that that would be expected to carry over as we continue to move forward with the construction of those facilities. However, once we get past fiscal 24, you can see that we are essentially flat, again, that 0.2% versus 0.1% growth in the U.S. compared to Kentucky, and almost identical in fiscal 26. Compared to last time, you can see we had forecasted a slight decrease in fiscal 25 and then also a decrease in fiscal 26. Those have been now replaced with essentially a zero growth rate in fiscal 25, that's 0.2%, and a positive 0.2% growth in fiscal 26. Manufacturing employment, again, similar story. We can see that the both the control and the optimistic have slight growth in the near term, followed by a moderation, whereas the pessimistic forecast is very negative. And here, breaking it out in terms of the control optimistic scenario for 25 and 26, all scenarios are negative. It's just a question of how negative. And obviously, there's a strikingly large difference between a decline of 1.5% and 0.7% in fiscal 25 and 26 in the control scenario versus the negative 4% and 2.2% in the pessimistic scenario for the same years. Again, in that near term, an unusual situation where we have significantly stronger growth in fiscal 24, but if you look back to the recent history in fiscal 23, you can see how much stronger our manufacturing growth was. Again, as I mentioned, if you look at industrial production statistics, if you do not include motor vehicles, manufacturing has been essentially flat to a slight decline, but manufacturing of vehicles has been growing by approximately 2.4%. So again, with Kentucky having a significant presence in the manufacturing of motor vehicles, it's not too surprising to see that we continue that slight edge over the U.S. as a whole in the near term. But once you get to fiscal 25 and 26, we decline, much like the rest of the United States, just not as much. And comparing what was presented last time, positives in the near term versus a previous minus 1.4% for fiscal 24, and then slightly more of a decline presented in this current forecast, 1.5% versus the 1.1% decline in fiscal 25, and in fiscal 26, again, 0.7% decline versus the 0.5% that was presented last time. Kentucky personal income, obviously the forecasts are essentially right on top of one another. It's very hard to see much of a difference here in the control optimistic graph. When you break it out, you can see that in the near term, there's very little difference in fiscal 24. We do see in fiscal 25 a little bit more of a slowdown in the growth of personal income in the pessimistic compared to the control, and then again the same thing in fiscal 26. Compared to our the U.S. versus Kentucky, no surprise, while we did lead, we did grow faster in fiscal 21, in all years in the forecast going forward, we're expected to trail the rate of growth in personal income in the U.S. versus that in Kentucky. Compared to what was presented last time, you can see strong growth in the near term, fiscal 24, and then just slightly more growth in fiscal 25, and essentially no difference compared to what was presented last time in fiscal 26. Wage and salary forecast. Here the pessimistic scenario is definitely more pessimistic. I know in the income slide, these three lines were essentially on top of each other, but you can see there is some differentiation here in the pessimistic forecast. And you can see that here as you compare the control optimistic pessimistic growth, especially once you get to 25 and 26. 3% or better growth in both the control and the optimistic, but in the pessimistic forecast, a 1.8% growth in 25 and 2.3% growth. So in the pessimistic scenario, significantly slower growth in wages and salaries. Compared to the U.S., again, in fiscal 23 and 24, slightly faster growth in fiscal 24 compared to the U.S., but in the out years, we are expected to go back to the unfortunately normal situation of growth of wages and salaries, trailing the growth rate of that of wages and salaries in the U.S. as a whole. Compared to what was presented last time, much stronger growth in the near term, 6 versus 4% for fiscal 24, slightly moderating compared to last time in fiscal 25, and in the same story in fiscal 26, 3.1% versus 3.5% growth. And finally, transfer payments. As you can see, there's essentially no difference in the transfer payments in terms of control optimistic, pessimistic. You can see that the overall growth rates, you can see that the pessimistic scenario, you would expect there to be more assistance provided by the federal government. So in the pessimistic scenario, you would see a larger growth. We have had a lot of factors that have changed the transfer payments. We've essentially had to go back and reassess everyone that was going to be on Medicaid. During the pandemic, it was an automatic resumption that you would be continued on the Medicaid program. Now, individuals must go back and be reassessed for the use of the Medicaid program. And the BEA has made an adjustment. I'm sure you recall the Supreme Court struck down the overall student loan forgiveness program. The Biden administration went back. They've now forgiven, I believe it's $135 billion, with another $5 billion announced yesterday. The BEA has handled that as a transfer of wealth from government to individuals. They did it, exactly, that's what they did. I also like to give away free money. It makes me popular. I will say, though, the BEA has done that as a one-time annualized adjustment for the first $118 billion in forgiveness through October, and the forgiveness that has been announced since then, I'm sure it will be done in this quarter. So that's how the different transfers have been accounted for. Compared to last time, you can see slightly more growth in transfer payments for fiscal 25, almost identical in fiscal 26. Hopefully that was a speed record. But if there's any questions or anything about the assumptions, I'll gladly do my best to answer them.
So I have one question. Do we have anything on a forecast of inflation?
We do. As you might imagine, it's expected to continue to moderate. And of course, if you've read if you've read the S&P Global, not Global Insight anymore, they cannot emphasize enough. They believe to get inflation to the Fed target of 2% PCE growth, there must be a slowdown in the labor force growth. And so they argue that for the Fed to reach that target, we need to see a significant reduction in hiring. Now, they made a significant announcement in the JOLTS data, just most recently. We are down 27% since the peak and approximately 16% year over year in the number of job openings, down from approximately 12 million at the peak, approximately 10 million at this time last year, and now we're down to approximately, I believe it's 8.3 million in the most recent data. Now, their overall forecast of inflation, I do have that here. I will look that up for you really quick. Core PCE declines gradually to 2% after recent surge. So they have us declining from the current approximately 4%, going under 3% by the first quarter of fiscal 25 and moderating down to an even 2% in the out years. Yes, sir.
I have one question. On the U.S. employment manufacturing slide.
Yes.
And you touched on it briefly, and I've looked through the documents. I couldn't really find much explanation for it. But because there's obviously a link of U.S. manufacturing, our own manufacturing, and if you look at that chart, even in the control and optimistic, you know, they're forecasting manufacturing employment to almost be back to pandemic levels in a relatively short period of time. And when I think about the policy issues that are going on to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., I couldn't find anything that would rationalize that dramatic of almost a hockey stick type of change from where we otherwise would have been and back to pandemic levels.
It is a lot. What I would say is, again, if you look at their forecast, especially in the manufacturing facilities that have been built in the industrial production section of the S&P Global forecast, they talk about the rush and how many facilities have been built. And so you can imagine something like the chips manufacturing, it's the CHIPS Act, but I do mean semiconductor chips. You can imagine how many individuals are involved in the ramp up to get that facility operating, but then this significant decline in the number of people who actually operate and work in a chips facility. And so I think part of it is, other than these areas of strong growth, and remember technically in manufacturing that also includes mining and other manufacturing workers, I think between the two, the pullback they see there, the pessimistic forecast is extremely pessimistic. You're absolutely correct. That drops us all the way back past where we were during the pandemic. But overall, I believe I can't remember if they used the word floundering or a malaise, but they mentioned, other than vehicle manufacturing, the overall lack of growth in manufacturing in the U.S. as a whole. Again, with vehicle manufacturer being the one bright spot.
Yeah, and I
That's
just,
not a lack of, sorry.
I was just going to say that, yeah, it just seems like these facilities you mentioned on the chip side are under construction, and that's not what this data is manufacturing. So the manufacturing employment hasn't even started yet.
Correct.
Similarly with, like, for example, in this state, the battery plant in Elizabethtown, they're just starting the hiring for that type of stuff.
Sure, I'm sorry.
And so you've got, you know, like, so a lot of policy issues in the government around a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act benefits are premised on domestically produced equipment.
Correct.
And so it seems like I'm just trying to, I mean, obviously it's not your forecast, but I just couldn't find anything that really in the documentation would be so pessimistic. When you look at where we were pre-pandemic, we've kind of back to above pre-pandemic levels, which kind of makes some sense. But now all of a sudden we go back to,
Right.
you know, and obviously that has implications for our own state and just as well as the general economy. So
Sure.
that's
I
my biggest
apologize.
uncertainty about this whole forecast is that particular
Sure.
variable.
I apologize. I wasn't clear. What I meant was the manufacturing required to make the items that are being used to construct the facilities. So the manufacturing worker who is making the items that are being used to build the chip plant.
Right.
Somebody is making the steel. Someone is processing and making the flooring tiles. Everything that goes into a large facility like that. I meant the ramp up in individual employment to make the items that are being used to construct these facilities. Once those are completed, I'm saying that those individuals might see a reduction in their employment overall. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I did not mean the construction workers building the chip plant. I meant the items that go into the construction of the chip plant.
And I would just also say, again, I have a very narrow view in the energy industry, but you know, we are seeing increased lead times on equipment.
Sure.
Not decreased lead times on
No.
equipment. So things are not getting, per se, much better for a lot of things that, you know, are being made to actually install in final products. So anyway, that's the one thing I don't know what to do about it, but it's the one that I'm kind of questionable.
Sure. No, I understand.
Thanks for your insight.
Are there any other questions? If not, I appreciate your time, and I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to make just a few remarks before we start the individual tax presentations. much in the line of what has changed since our last meeting. Basically two things have changed. The general fund comparison has changed in terms of when we met in September, the year-to-date growth, albeit only July and August, was 7.4%. As we sit here through October, not through today, but through October, which is what all our slides are based on, is through October, general fund growth is 5.6%. So revenue growth has lost some pace. In particular, September grew at 6.1%, and October grew at 1.9%, bringing the year-to-date growth from 7.4 to 5.6. The economic comparison between last time and this time, I think Michael portrayed very accurately. One of the variables that kicks into a lot of our revenue bases is wages and salaries, and Michael had a chart on that. Better growth in 24, slightly worse than 25 and 26. But for revenue forecasting, the levels are better in all years and all scenarios. And levels actually are kind of, I know we seem to over concentrate on growth rates when we do our presentations, but levels are what you plug back into your regressions and get your forecasted values. So the levels are better for wages and salaries. And while real GDP is not in any specific tax equation, variables, it's an example of a wide berth of U.S. activity. Again, it's better in 24, worse in 25, a little bit better in 26. But again, the levels have improved for all years and all scenarios. What I draw from that is higher economic levels produce higher revenue forecasts. So, ceteris paribus, from an economic standpoint, we would expect slightly higher revenue estimates than we presented in September. And the general fund part, I wouldn't expect worse necessarily, because if you remember at the last meeting, even though we only had data through August, we completed that first quarter on the sales tax and individual, which is 75% of the general fund. We did a short-term forecast of September, so we treated the first quarter as a historical quarter for 75% of the general fund. And obviously, since we only have October, 1 month into the second fiscal quarter of 24, we didn't really use the quarter to date data in this forecast, because I can see doing a short-term model for 1 month, but two months was a little bit more than we're comfortable with. Just a really quick general fund update. Despite the growth slowing a little bit, receipts continue to show growth. I've already said September was 6.1, October 1.9. The general fund has grown 5.6% through October. The sales tax is up 6.3%, which is good. The individual income tax has grown 4.5%, which is a bit of a head scratcher until you remember that pass-through entity tax that was adopted. We've received through October $255.4 million in collections from that tax, and we know that some of that is going to, there's a dollar for dollar refundable credit for payment of the PTET. So when that dollar for dollar credit is used later in the fiscal year or next fiscal year, there'll be ramifications. So the better indicator, I think, of individual income tax is the withholding amount, and that's down 4.4%. The major business taxes have fallen 4.6%. When we met in September, major business taxes were up. You know, granted it's only July and August, but they were up like 87%. September hit, and we got a light bag on declaration payments and so forth. So major big business taxes through October are down 4.6%, despite the rosier picture we gave you in September. And income on investment has grown $73.5 million so far this fiscal year. Substantial growth. That certainly helps the year-to-date growth of 5.6%, having $73.5 million of growth in investment income. Now, to hit the preliminary estimate we set last time, which was $15,394.2 million, through the final 8 months of the year, growth would need to be 0.2%. 0.2% for the remaining 8 months of the year. Just a mathematical calculation. I won't make any remarks on whether that's reasonable or unreasonable. It's just a mathematical calculation. Just a quick road fund update. Gene's going to go a much deeper dive into this, obviously, but road fund receipts have increased 7.9% in October, and growth stands at 9.6% through the first 4 months of the fiscal year. Motor fuels. Let me get my note on motor fuels. Motor fuels increased 20.2% in September and 10.7% in October, and stand at 13.2% growth for the year, which is pretty stout. Motor vehicle usage was 1.6% in September, 7.6% in October, and now stands at 4.4% through the first 4 months of the year. Doing the same mathematical needs calculation for the road fund as I did for the general fund, to hit the preliminary estimate that we came up with in September of $1,879.8 million, we would need to grow at 6.1%. And again, I won't make any remarks on whether that's reasonable, too high, too low, but that's the mathematical calculation, 6.1%. Keep in mind, as Gene will go through, the motor fuels rate is considerably higher than it was in the early part of last year, when the governor did a executive order to freeze the gasoline tax rate, the motor fuels tax rate, due to hard economic times and rising with inflation being what it was. So this year we're 4.1 cents per gallon higher in the early part of the year. So we're making some hay on motor fuels. But I don't want to steal Gene's thunder, so I'll quit right there. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Thomas Jones, who will go through the forecast for the individual income tax and then follow it up with a coal severance tax presentation. Thomas, you want to trade? Microphone.
Thank you. Let's switch gears to receipts and start with the individual income tax. Here's a little bit of the receipts history for the individual income tax account. You can see the decline in fiscal 23 of 3.4%. That was almost entirely due to the rate reduction from 5% to 4.5%. And that's only a half-year effect, as that went into effect in January. So only 6 months of reduction occurred and resulted in a 3.4% decline in receipts. The next rate reduction will occur on January 1st, 2024, and it's already expected, or it's going to fall from 4.5% to 4.0%. And you can see the second to last line, the first quarter of FY24, that row contains $187 million in pass-through entity payments. This is the pass-through entity tax is a new tax and the account is a fifth account in the individual income tax. So all pass-through entity payments will now end up in the individual income tax account. In the first quarter of fiscal 24, withholding fell by 0.8%, and declarations declined by 33%. In October, you can see that receipts fell by 9.3%. Very little pass-through entity payments occurred in that month. We received $68 million in pass-through entity payments. The federal due date was September the 15th, so we believe that the lion's share of the pass-through entity payments are now in the bank. In October, withholding fell by 14.1%, and declarations, it was a non-declarations month, but declarations fell by 44%. Just 2 days ago, the November receipts were published, and we received $366 million in individual income tax receipts. That's a 10.5% decline from last year. Next slide, please.
Quick question for you.
Sure.
On the withholding.
Yes, sir.
And it may be hard to estimate this. I don't know how big it would be. I think the UAW strike that was in that October-ish time period, and I don't know if that would have any material impact on withholding, since those people, a large number of people, were not at work. We don't need to answer that right now, but I just was curious. I looked at that timing, and there was also things going on. And
Well, it should, but I don't think that's in the history. And as this was a September forecast, I don't think that that's in the history at all.
Okay, that's fine.
And no attempt to estimate that was made.
Yeah, and I just don't know how material it would be in the overall scheme of things, because I know there are also some other suppliers that were perhaps not working as much, et cetera. So, okay.
Unfortunately, that was not in the history.
Okay, great. Thanks.
We're on the withholding methodology slide. Okay. This is an econometric model that I use for withholding. It uses Kentucky wages and salary as the only independent variable. This is the same model specification that I used in September. It continues to be the best fitting model for forecasting withholding receipts. As a rule, it's a very well-behaved series. Just like in September, I altered the history of withholding to get a policy-neutral withholding series. I forecast that series normally, and then I subtracted all of the adjustments to get back to a solid y-hat. This is the same 90% share of tax law legislative impacts that I used in September, so I'm going to be showing you the 90-10 split again. I'll take a deeper look at that in just a moment. Next slide, please. I'm just going to cover the methodology of each tax and then go into a deeper dive of each of the components afterwards. The declarations model is a simple three-quarter moving average model. 10% of the tax law changes went into the declarations model, and I did the exact same thing. I made an adjustment to the history of declarations, got my policy neutral series. I estimated using the three-quarter moving average model, and then I subtracted off all of the tax law changes to get to a forecasted series. And those are the exact same tax modifications that we used last time in September. For net returns, the base model is a three-quarter moving average model, just as we've used in the past. But I've made two modifications to that model this time to account for pass-through entity alterations, should I say. And I'll go through those in more detail in a moment. For purposes of forecasting, I put the pass-through entity and the net returns. I forecast them together. It is believed that the pass-through entity bill was meant to be close to tax revenue neutral as possible, and I'll show you what the scores for that bill were a little bit later. So the two adjustments are: there's an adjustment for a decline from FY24 to FY25, and that's because the pass-through entity payers are currently paying on 2 years of tax year liabilities, that is tax year 22 and tax year 23, and they're making payments on both of those right now in fiscal 24. In fiscal 25, the majority of people who are paying into the pass-through entity account will only be paying on their tax year 23 liabilities. So I expect the receipts in FY25 to go down relative to 24. And I'll explain that in a little more detail in a moment. Oh, and I'm sorry, don't go ahead just yet. The fiduciary model is exactly the same as we've used in the past. It's a 3/4 moving average model. Next slide, please. So here's the split, the 90-10 split in the legislative adjustments. In column 1, you can see the total legislative adjustments that were made to the individual income tax account, and 90% went into withholding and 10% went into declarations. Next slide, please. That's the exact same slide that I presented in September. And here you can see the official score for the pass-through entity legislation. Negative 13 million for 24, 13.5 in 25, and 14 million in FY26. I still believe that these are the expectations of what's going to happen with the pass-through entity legislation. And just conceptually, you should think about the pass-through legislation impact as pass-through entity payments plus the credits that they're going to get to their individual income tax form when they file in April. And that's going to show up in our net returns account. And that's why I forecast these two the same in the net returns account, because they're sort of offsetting, and most of the results of the pass-through entity legislation are going to show up in the net returns account of individual income tax. Next, please. So switch back to withholding for a moment. This is the one independent variable in the withholding account. It looks like a normal spread where the optimistic is on top. The optimistic and control are very similar, just as Michael had said. In fact, the difference between the optimistic and the control are very similar even at the final quarter of FY26. There's only a $1.8 billion difference in the final quarter. That's just a 1.4% difference. So the optimistic and control are very similar, and the pessimistic lies below that. The next slide, please. So here's the forecast results for the withholding account. The overwhelming impact in the withholding account is the legislative effect. That's the decrease of the tax rate from 5% to 4.5% for the FY24 column, and then the additional impact of the 4.5% to 4% decrease in tax rates for the FY25 column. And as the legislative impacts for FY25 and 26 are nearly identical, what you're seeing in the FY26 column is a pure economic effect in withholding. There's no visible change in the tax law effects for the 26 column. Next slide, please. All right, let's switch gears back to net returns, which is certainly the most complicated of the 5 components this time. As I said before, I'm for purposes of forecasting, I'm estimating pass-through entity and net returns accounts together. There's 2 alterations or adjustments that I've made to the normal way that I forecast net returns because of this tax legislation. The first of those 2 alterations is the idea that in FY24, pass-through entities are paying on 2 years of liabilities, and in fiscal 25 and 26, they're going to be paying on only 1 year of tax liabilities, and therefore I've reduced my assumptions about the impact of the payments and the credits in 25 and 26. I've reduced them by 25% of what I estimated for 24. And the second impact, the second alteration or adjustment that I've made to net returns is I've assumed that because the actual filing date for the pass-through entity legislation, they've given the pass-throughs the right to declare and file all the way to August of 24. That puts us all the way into fiscal 25. And so it is my belief that there will be some entities who will file in fiscal 25 with their FY24 liabilities. And so what I've done is I've assumed that 20% of those FY24 receipts and credits will show up in FY25. And so I'll show you a shift. I'm going to show you in detail what I've done here on the next slide. So those are the two alterations or adjustments that I've made to net returns. So let's take a deeper look at and a clearer look at what I've done. Next slide, please. Thank you, Michael. Sorry, Gene. So in the first column, the net returns model column, that's my normal net returns model, which is a 3-quarter moving average model that accounts for seasonality and other cyclical effects. And the second column, the PTE credits column, that's my estimation of PTE credits. It's on an annual basis, but I split them up into the quarters in an even fashion. So I do not believe that we're going to get precisely negative 87.6% in credits in the second quarter. It's just the sum of those three that are going to end up in fiscal year 24. But what I wanted to illustrate here with showing you the PTE credits column is the shift of credits. If you look at the focus on the negative 128.2 in the first quarter of FY25, what's happened there is there's a shift of $67 million from FY24 credits that are going to end up being processed in FY25. And so those credits from 24 get processed in 25, and they were moved one fiscal year ahead. And so that's what that illustration there is trying to show. And you can also see, I'm going to show you in the next slide, the payments and the credits from 24 to 25 decline. And it'll be easier to see in the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is the exact same illustration as the previous slide, but in fiscal year form. And you can see in the payments column, it's very easy to see the decline of 25% going from 24 to 25. And in the credits column, there's two effects going on in the credits column. There's the reduction of the credits going from 24 to 25, and there's also the shift from that 1 quarter from 24 to 25, shifting some of the credits from 24 forward into 25. And you can see the sum of those in the credits column. And the far right column, the net NETR column, that's the sum of all of the alterations. Next slide, please. This is the declarations forecast, and this contains the 10% of the legislative impacts. Those declines are largely the caused by the decline in the as a result of the legislative impacts. Next slide, please. And the fiduciary, we forecasted the fiduciary in the exact same way as we have in the past. The only difference being is that this year we've had significantly more refunds in this account. You can see in FY23 we ended the year with a balance of minus $5.7 million. The only thing that's changed since I presented in September is 2 new months of data. In September, the account declined by $1 million. In October, the account declined by $2.3 million. So year to date, we're minus $5.8 million. And the way this account usually runs, it's negative for the whole year. And then in October, all of the positive receipts are accumulated, and it usually falls into the very small positive territory. But last year, the refunds were higher than the pay-ins, and I expect the same thing to happen for the next several years. So we're on track right now at year to date. Last year to date was positive $400,000, and this year we are running at minus $5.8 million year to date. So we're right on track with this forecast. Next slide, please. So here I have the summation of the optimistic, control, and pessimistic scenarios, and the only change here is the withholding. Everything in the fiduciary, net returns, and declarations is the same. There's no different scenarios for those 3 components. And the declines in FY24 are driven entirely by the legislative adjustments. The adjustments in 25 and 26 are nearly identical legislative adjustments. And you can see the decline in FY25 is partially an increase caused by an increase in the legislative adjustment compared to FY24. They're both declines, but it was not as large, and also partially the result of shifting some of the credit from 24 to 25. And the FY26 growth rate represents what I like to think of as an economic impact in withholding and all the other components. So you get a positive effect there. Next slide, please. And here's a comparison between September and December forecasts. You can see that in FY24 is the largest difference of $180 million. The majority of the difference in that forecast is for Kentucky wages and salary. Our MAC model, which is based on the Global Insight model, the S&P Global model, was their forecast was shifted up, so they are more optimistic in their control scenario. $1.9 billion in the final quarter of FY26. So there's just a small difference between the optimistic and the control. And the rest of the difference is due to the fact that net returns, it was due to net returns quarter one was slightly better than we had forecasted in the previous forecast. That's all I have for individual. Are there any questions? Oh, next slide, please. I broke out the differences by the four components of individual income tax, so you can see where the changes happened from September to December. You can see the majority happened in withholding, and one small upward revision in net returns, and then the declarations and fiduciary were slightly less. Any questions on individual? All right, let's move on to Cole.
I have a few questions on the individual.
Sure.
Would you go back to slide, I believe it's slide 12, where you have your withholding forecast?
Forecast.
Yeah. Under control, it looks like you've got for the year that you're expecting a 1.6% decline.
That's right.
Okay. And year-to-date, the decline is, in withholding, is 4.4%. Is that correct?
Oh, let me see here. I only have the quarterly growth rates. I don't have the year-to-date for withholding. Just one second.
Year-to-date withholding was down 14.1% in October, and year-to-date is negative 4.4%.
Yeah.
So to get to 1.6, you're basically saying in the last 8 months of this fiscal year, there's going to be an improvement in withholding relative to the 4.4.
An improvement, yes.
Yes, yes. So
Declining, but an improvement.
yeah, I think it's basically flat. If you do, did you do a withholding needs report or estimate?
I don't think that was one of the slides.
No, it was not.
No,
It
I don't
was not.
think there was one
I
of the
think
slides.
if you do that math, for the control scenario for 24, you have to bring in about the same amount of money withholding payments the last 8 months of this fiscal year as you did the last 8 months of last fiscal year to get to 1.6%.
I'll have to take your word for it. I
Okay,
didn't work it out.
Well, think about it. If you got 4 months at minus 4.4 and for the year you're going to be minus 1.6, it's going to have to be closer to zero for the last 8 months to get you to minus 1.6.
An improvement. I don't know if it's going to be positive or not.
Okay. And I'm not saying it's going to be positive. It's going to be
Close to zero.
That math is like minus
Close to zero.
0.25%.
Right, close to zero.
So what is it about, and if you look at the Kentucky wages and salary by quarter for 24, I believe in the last half of this fiscal year that growth rate, those quarterly growth rates are lower compared to the first 2 quarters of this fiscal year. It's like 5.1% and 4% in the third and fourth quarters versus 7.1 and 7.8 for the quarter one and quarter two. So my question is, how do you get, given that you may have a slowdown in wages and salary, what is it about the what is it about your model that produces a result that we're going to bring in about the same amount of money in withholding in the next 8 months as we did the last 8 months of last fiscal year with a rate reduction?
Right. Well, as I explained how the methodology for the withholding model is set up, I first took and created a policy neutral series for withholding. Then I forecasted withholding, and then I took off and reduced all of the withholding numbers by the full impact of all the tax legislation. So while the model has positive growth rates for withholding in the model, once you impose the tax law changes at the end of the model, after the model, it's post-model adjustments, when you subtract all of those tax law changes off, then you get this negative 6% growth rate.
Negative 6% growth rate. Mm-hmm. Where's the negative?
I'm sorry,
6?
1.6, forgive me, 1.6.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I'm
yes.
saying that you're going to have to be better than that in the last 8 months of the fiscal year.
You have to be better than that. I don't believe that. I think it's going to be negative 1.6%.
That's for the year. I'm talking about for the last 8 months of this fiscal year. It would have to improve.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree that it's going to improve in
And
the, in
why
the next
will
8
that
months.
happen?
Well, in the next 7 months, yes.
Why will that happen? What part of the Kentucky economic forecast and the MAC model and your approach gets you that result?
I must not be understanding your question properly.
Okay.
When I look at the results of the withholding forecast, I'm seeing positive growth rates. They're all positive growth rates when I forecast the withholding series, which I didn't present that because that would obfuscate the fact that these large tax law changes are then subtracted off of those.
I understand that. Okay. The next question is, if you go to the next slide, on slide 13, I believe it is. For the first year, for the pass-through entity tax, because there was a retroactive part of it, as you correctly point out, there's 2 tax years of payments going into this fiscal year. That's your first bullet point.
Sure.
And so for next year, you say there's 1 tax year
That's correct.
going into that. So if you only have 1 tax year in the second year and 2 in the first year, why is it not a 50% reduction instead of a 25%?
Well, it's not a perfect 1-to-1. Some tax filers are still going to be filing for 2 in fiscal 24 and in fiscal 25. Mm-hmm. Some people they don't have to make their decision until 25. So some taxpayers are not even going to are still going to be paying for 2 tax year liabilities in fiscal 25, but it's a very small number of people. It's a very complicated.
So why
I've
shouldn't it be
separated it all.
closer to 50% than 25% then, if it's a small number of
Well, I could have
filers?
picked 26%.
Yeah, okay.
I believe that 25% is the correct amount. 24 is too low, 26 is too high.
On the next slide for net returns adjustment, and let's just think about, I was looking at fiscal year 24 first. When you look at total payments there for 24, I think it's like $315 million. 315.4, if you add up that last column for fiscal year 24. 187.4, 113, and 15.
Right?
And then the credits are smaller than that, 262.8.
Some credits were taken from 24
I understand.
and shifted into 25.
Yeah, understand that.
Right.
So net for that year, you're positive 52.6 for the pass-through entity. Is that correct?
Let's take a look.
Is that for payments, less credits, you'd be positive 52.6?
Well, if you sum the credits for 24, you get negative 262. Mm-hmm. And if you sum the credits for 25, you get negative 315.
No. I'm talking about for fiscal year 24, you're going to get how much in payments from PTET? It's the last column. It's $315 million.
315.4.
315, yeah.
If you take away the credits for fiscal year 24, it's
Right.
262.8.
Right?
So that difference, that's a positive 52.6.
That's correct.
In your previous slide, slide 10, you have the PT legislative adjustment as minus 13
Well,
for 24.
yes.
So how do you reconcile that?
What happened is some of the legislative effect of 24 is going to slip into 25 because of the processing date. So while those are the official scores of the bill, I don't believe that that exact distribution, minus 13, minus 13.5, and minus 14, I don't believe that they're gonna fall in processing dates just like that. So what I've done with if you go to the other slide, please, Greg, would you go to the previous slide? No, I'm sorry. Go to the net returns adjustment slide where all the data is. So the shift from fiscal 24 to 25, the negative 128, by shifting some of that money from 24 to 25, it altered the negative 13, negative 13.5, and negative 14. But as you can see at the bottom of that slide, when you sum up all 3 years, they still sum up to negative 40.5. Yeah. So even though I've shifted some of that decline in 24 to 25, they still sum up to the negative 40.5, which is the sum of the 13, 13.5, and negative 14.
But I would argue that they're distributed differently, because I think in the first year you have a positive 52.6 when you take the difference between payments and credits. It's a minus 79 for fiscal year 25, and then a minus 13.8 for fiscal year 26. So yes, when you sum those, you still get to the 40, but you're getting there a different way. It's not minus 13, minus 13.5.
That is correct.
Yeah.
I was simply showing what the official bill score was, and this is how I've altered it. And I mentioned that in my opening statements, that I have altered the methodology for net returns in two ways. And this slide shows how both of those ways sum together and still get the aggregate scoring of the original bill.
And so that, because it's positive 52 and 24, then that helped to increase the estimate for the individual income tax relative to September, because you didn't do it this way in September.
That is correct. I did not make these two alterations in September because I believe that what's going to happen with the way the credits are going to be processed, it's going to fall into FY25 and they're going to get pushed a little bit. And I think that's more realistic of how the receipts are going to be processed, and therefore I think we need to make an adjustment for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But your point is important, because it's materially important that the negative 13 and the negative 13.5 are not going to be the same. And that's why I think it was important that we made this change now, because the credits part, while I think that it's probable that the payments part are going to end up in the right categories, the credits part, when they file their returns and it shows up in our net returns column, that's going to be altered slightly, and they're going to be processed differently. And so I thought it was important for us to make that 25% shift from 24 to 25 to account for that.
Thank you. So you said before on slide 8 that you included net returns, you adjusted for net returns for PTE in your model, and then you subtracted the credits again. So is that counting those twice?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Let's see. If you adjusted in your model to account for the credits from PTT, and then you've subtracted again on slide number 15? No.
I think you're confusing the tax law changes of the withholding and declarations with the pass-through entity tax law change. Those are two completely separate things. So the negative 13, negative 13.5, and negative 14 is entirely separate from the withholding and declarations adjustments.
All right.
I only accounted for the pass-through entity adjustment one time.
Yeah. Thomas, can you remind us, in your presentation you've got minus 40 million on the pass-through entity tax, or credits are slightly more than payments over this 3-year period. Why would credits, help me understand or help the group understand? Because
right.
This is how
the original idea.
How would credits exceed payments if you have to make a payment before you can take a credit?
I think the idea behind the original score of the bill, why would credits be greater than the original pass-through entity payments? The original idea, of course, was for it to be policy neutral, to be tax revenue neutral. But I think the original scorer felt that credits are going to be a little bit higher because of the way that the pass-through entity is going to file their federal income tax. It's going to lower their federal AGI a little bit. So if that lowers their federal AGI, then the starting point for Kentucky, which is federal AGI on their tax return, is going to be reduced a tiny bit. So even though The two were meant to be the same. I think the number of credits that they're going to end up getting on the Kentucky form is going to be a little bit greater because the starting point is going to be a little bit lower on the Kentucky form. I think that's what the original score believed when they generated the -13, -13.5, and -14 scores for the bill. So originally, it was the idea was that to be tax neutral, but I think the official score felt that it was going to be a little bit more in credits because of that fact. I was not the original scorer of the bill.
But you're still keeping it in your forecast. The
Yes.
the minus 40.5.
I,
and so,
I am because I feel that they were right.
Okay, and so.
And
I
I'm bound by it. I'm actually bound by it. I'm bound by the statute and the official score. The consensus forecasting group is not bound by it, but I am.
And I understand that there will be an adjustment to federal AGI, the starting point, but in filing your Kentucky individual income tax, you would then have to make a Schedule M adjustment for that. For that excess deduction at the federal level. So, and we don't need to argue about this, but
So
I don't think that it can be negative.
You want to argue that the net effect of the bill would be zero?
Yes.
I think you and I are on the same page because that was my belief as well when I scored the first bill. I scored it, but it wasn't the official score. But it is a small change, -13 million. Any other questions on individual?
Before we move on, if there aren't any questions on individual, there was an expressed interest in having a break around the 10:30 hour. My clock says 10:27. So, Mr. Chair, how long would you like to break for? 10 minutes? Okay, we'll adjourn for 10, or be in recess for a period of 10 minutes.
Text me inside if you need any information.
I believe we're ready to go.
Next slide, please. All right, so let's dive into coal. Coal receipts forecast. Here's a little bit of the coal receipts history. Oh yeah, fun coal facts. So this is the first time ever in October of 2023. This is the first time ever that we've had the whole month end at a negative amount. So the account was negative $1 million for the month. It's just a pure coincidence that a number of refunds went out on one day. That was October 13th of October, and I can't tell you the precise number or the number of individuals involved, but the number was just north of $7 million in refunds that went out on one day, and it was purely a coincidence. It wasn't planned or anything like that. So the net result was negative $1 million. So I can tell you that had those refunds not gone out on that one day, receipts for October, that is all the normal payments that came in for coal severance tax for October, that number would be a number which was a decrease of 12% over the previous October. So it was still a decline, but it wasn't a negative, a deficit. Next slide, please. 3 of the last quarters have had declining severed tons. The fourth quarter of FY23 was the outlier of those 4 months. We had increase of 81% severed tons. Keep in mind that we are still near all-time low in severed tons, so while some of these growth rates are kind of gaudy, we're still very, very low on a historical basis for where severed tons are. And that increase of 81 million is really more of a statement about what happened in the base quarter year, in the base quarter, because fiscal 22, the fourth quarter of fiscal 22, was one of the lowest we've ever had. It was the all-time low. And fiscal 22 as a fiscal year was the all-time low for severed tons. Next slide, please. Here's the NYMEX spot market prices for coal for the 5 different grades of coal that they sell in the NYMEX. The asterisks on each of these, on several of these items, the asterisk means that the comparison year, the comparison week, the price from a year ago was the all-time record price for that particular grade of coal. So for the Central Appalachian coal, that's $73 million. 1 year ago, that week, the price of Central Appalachian coal was $187.50. That was the all-time record for coal. So for that grade of coal. So you can see that prices have come down significantly. In the case of Central Appalachian coal, it's just a little bit lower than half the price. And for the Illinois Basin coal, you can see there that in October of 20th of October, the week of October the 20th, the price for Illinois Basin the previous year was a record high of $186.50. That's 60 cents. So now it's 66% lower than it was a year ago. Next slide, please. This is the same methodology that I used in September and have used many, many times. In September, the income variable, this is a demand model structure, so it's alternate prices and income. So the income variable sometimes changes because they're all very similar. This time in September, I used the U.S. personal income, and this time I used real GDP. So there was a small change to the model specification, but not very much as way of impact. The other models were all econometrically sound, but this one performed the best. I used the Aki-Iki criterion, and it was the smallest Aki-Iki criterion, so I used this model specification. As I mentioned earlier, there were several large refunds in October, and that was all included in the model, and I made adjustments for that one October observation. Next slide, please. So I'll go over some of the independent variables and their forecasts. Here you can see this is actually 3. This is the control pessimistic and optimistic. They're nearly on top of each other. So S&P Global feels very strongly about the shape of this curve. regardless of the scenario assumptions. Next slide, please. And this is, Michael presented the, he didn't present the West Texas Intermediate price of oil, but this is very similar to the slide that Michael showed you, where the pessimistic lies above the control and optimistic. And the paths converge for optimistic, control and optimistic, the paths converge in FY25, and they all have identical observations in FY26. That's just for control, for for control and optimistic. In the pessimistic path, prices rise throughout FY24, and then they start falling in FY25, and then they rise again throughout 26. So they're very different patterns that are going on in these two optimistic versus control and pessimistic. Next slide, please. So this is the Henry Hub price of gas. Again, they feel very strongly about this path of natural gas prices through the forecast horizon, regardless of scenario. It's rising. Next slide, please. And this is a slightly different real GDP than what Michael presented. This is just real GDP. This is not in constant dollars. And again, the three scenarios, even though I've altered the series slightly, this is the normal real GDP that gets presented by BEA, and they're very similar to what Michael presented. Next slide, please. So here's the forecast for coal for all three scenarios. The pessimistic lies above the control, and the optimistic lies below the control. And this is just because of the price effects of oil in the oil model. Next slide, please. And here's the comparison from September. The changes are very small. Even after the $8 million in refunds are applied to the FY24, the December forecast is still a little bit stronger than the September for 24. The big difference between the two forecasts is the speed of decline in receipts for FY25, and there's a significant slowdown in the losses for FY25 relative to the September forecast. In FY26, the declines accelerate to 22.8%. By the end of the forecast horizon, coal receipts are just $6 million higher than the September scenario. So at the end of the scenario, they're closer together than they are in FY25. That's all I have for coal. Any questions? Okay.
All right, sales tax is one of mine. You've seen this graph before, so I'm not going to talk much about it. The long run growth is 4.6% if you include 21, 22, and 23. Just the arithmetic mean of the years is 4.6. If you exclude the I don't know why you'd want to, but if you excluded fiscal 21, 22, and 23, the arithmetic mean of the growth rates is 3.3, but so 4.6 is the average growth rate. The other thing I wanted to point out was if you can see fiscal 19, the 9.2%, which was a pre-pandemic fast-growing year, that was the first of the base broadenings, House Bill 487, which had a score on it of $272 million a year. It broadened the base on the sales tax the first time, and the second base broadening that occurred was effective 1/1/23, and that was from House Bill 8 of the 2022 session. And that had a longer run fiscal impact of about $100 million. It didn't broaden it as much as the earlier base increase, but those are the 2 years where you had base broadenings in the sales tax. The base broadenings in the sales tax, coupled with the rate reductions in the individual income tax, have catapulted the sales tax into being the most productive tax account that we have in Kentucky. So what has changed since September? Year-to-date growth is continuing to be strong, 6.3% through October. If you calculate the needs just for the sales tax to hit the September estimate, it would be 2.5%. So we've grown 6.3% year-to-date. The needs for the rest of the year for the September estimate would be 2.5%. Other changes since September, we have a new S&P Global forecast for the structural models and a new MAC forecast for other structural models and the VAR model. I ran a new ARIMA specification. I'll talk about that very briefly. It made very little difference. I did a new VAR specification. I added an exogenous predetermined variable. I reevaluated the fiscal impacts as well. We did have that base broadening from the 2022 session, and we also, as I talked about in September, we had that Century Aluminum thing that was the court case that was a deduction. I've reevaluated those fiscal impacts based on some conversations with the Department of Revenue, and I'll report on the findings of those new calculations on the fiscal impacts. And I'll just sum it up to say most of the new calculations point to the need for an upward revision to the sales tax vis-a-vis September. Here are the growth rates year to date for the sales tax: 5.3, 5.0, and then new information, 6.1 from September and 9.0 in October. The 9.0 in October is a little, it's got some administrative issues in it in terms of payments, incentive payments that happen at a certain time each year. They didn't happen in October, so it was a little bit inflated the month of October, but still we're getting good growth, far more than 2.5 needed to hit the estimate. In terms of the model specifications, I do my composite forecasting as usual. My time series is the same as it's been for several sessions of the CFG, 2010 quarter one to 2023 quarter three. Have data back much further, but I've chosen to use 2010 as a starting point for the models. Of course, I use seasonally adjusted data because there's seasonality in sales tax. And I use differences because clearly the sales tax is not a stationary series in levels. In terms of the ARIMA model, I said I fit a new ARIMA model. I'll show you the difference a couple slides later, but this time it was a 313, the first and third AR terms, the first difference, and the first and third moving average terms. The second part of the blend is a VAR model, and again I use sales and personal income like I did in September, but I added an exogenous variable, nominal retail sales including food services. I added that as an exogenous variable to make it more reasonable to use this as part of the blending process. If you don't have anything that has a MAC model variable or a S&P Global variable, VARs, you can't really have a control optimistic pessimistic because there's no variable that drives that. So I included an exogenous variable so I could do control optimistic pessimistic. And again, I did structural models You can see the structural models I tried, and in typical fashion for a composite forecaster, I blended those 5 models to have a single entry into the structural model composite. Next, I'm just going to show some of the exogenous variables and show that essentially the levels of the variables lie above the levels that they did in September. What was meant to be UT orange turns out kind of peach. Is the December, and the blue is September. So in all cases, the level is higher for the December forecast for retail sales, including food services. State and local personal tax receipts is a variable that S&P Global puts out. Some of my buddies in other states use this variable in their sales tax models. I found it to be quite a useful variable. I switched colors on you, unfortunately, by mistake. In this case, December is blue, and the peach is September. So in all cases, the December line lies above the September line. Another one was the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. Surprisingly, that comes in quite significant. I say surprisingly because you had a decline in that series during some of the years when the sales tax grew the quickest. You know, the 12, the 11.1, and the 10 were years when the consumer sentiment during the COVID period was falling. So, but yet it comes in strongly significant with the proper sign. And in all cases, December lies above September. If you take all the structural models that I did and plot them on the same line, you get this graph. The two that are, I guess, the lower ones would be U.S. retail sales, nominal retail sales, including food services, and Kentucky wages and salaries are the two lower ones. And then the other three are a little bit higher than that, and I blended them equally. I did not use restricted least squares. I did an equal blend of the models. I stole this shading. I find it useful because the axis is in calendar years, and because it's from a program eViews, and so the axis is actually in calendar quarters. They're calendar quarters, and so I stole from Gene the shading and the labeling of the 24, 25, 26 to make it a little easier to see what's going on, and I shrunk the history to blow up the differences between the models. These are the blended models for each the control, optimistic, and pessimistic scenarios. Even shrinking the model, even shrinking the history, and so forth, you don't have a big difference between control, optimistic, pessimistic on the basis of structural models. And there's nothing, weird about this. The pessimistic is the green and it's lowest. The control is the blue and it's in the middle, and the peach color is optimistic and it's the highest, like you would expect. But the difference is not too huge. The vertical axis is millions of dollars, and that's a quarter. So the optimistic forecast at the end of fiscal 26 gets up to about 1.6 billion for a quarter, which is 533 million a month, which is a pretty, we've only had 5 months ever that have exceeded $500 million. So the optimistic is kind of pushing a little bit towards uncharted territories for sales tax growth. Here's why I say the ARIMA model the respecification didn't make that much difference. You'd think going from a 711 to a 313, you would have a bigger difference than is showing up, but you don't. The ARIMA model, regardless of specification, the 7 was a stretch in September. I'll tell you, it was right on the edge of being significant at the 10% level. I kept it in. This time when I put in the true value for September, it was just barely out. So I took the 7 AR term out and ended up with a 313. But again, very little difference made from December to September in terms of the ARIMA model. And here's the difference in the VAR from September to December. This is I would say more significant, a bigger gap, I shall say, and it has to be the addition of the exogenous variable that I added, which is nominal retail sales. I don't know what else to say about it, but that pushes the forecast up. That particular, because the structural pushed it up a little, the VAR pushed it up a little, the ARIMA didn't push it up at all. So anyway, just a factual. If you're following along in your book, this is not the slide in your book. The slide in your book was wrong. I had a wrong slide. So this is the slide that was meant to be in your book as slide number. Slide numbers are gone for some reason. I think during the break we added a slide and it took away my slide numbers for some reason. But yeah, so if you're following along with a book, you're not seeing what's on the screen. But what I meant to show was the Kentucky personal income that comes out of the VAR versus what comes out of the MAC model, the Kentucky macroeconomical model. And when you do a VAR with personal income and sales tax, you essentially get a free throwaway forecast of personal income. You don't really care about the personal income forecast because you're running the VAR to get a sales tax forecast. But rather than throw it away, I looked at it and compared it to the MAC model, and if they were wildly different, you would cast aspersions on your VAR, thinking, man, it's something's not right here. The fact that they're very close to one another, to me, gives a little bit more support to the use of the VAR. And again, I didn't use VACs or co-integration this time. I just used a straight traditional VAR. Here is the final blending of the sales tax. The VAR is on top. The ARIMA model is slightly below, and the structural model is actually produced the lowest of the three forecasts that were used in the composite forecast. One more thing before I show you the final sales tax estimates. I told you I reevaluated the fiscal impacts, and I just want to be straight up front with you. We had some time to talk to the Department of Revenue about how's that new sales tax expansion going. We put a number of close to $100 million on it. How's the money coming in? Had the discussion about the Century Aluminum case, which I told you last time. It has two parts. The direct pay, the DPAs would pay less, and we would have to kick out some refunds, ask them how that process was going. And through those discussions, which I don't want to get real specific about because of confidentiality and so forth, but what I did was I took $20 million off all the fiscal impacts that were presented last time, and then from there since there was still some uncertainty in the forecast, I took, when I say take off, I mean less negative. So when I said I lowered them, I lowered the absolute value of the fiscal impact since they're negatives. So for the optimistic, I took off 25 million more of the negative fiscal impact, and for the pessimistic, I added back 25 million because there's still things that could go the wrong way. So in addition to being, I think, a better representation of what could be the worst and best case scenario, it also gives you a little separation between control optimistic, pessimistic, because you're not getting it from the structure models, and you're not getting it so much from the VAR model, control optimistic, pessimistic. So here are the sales tax projections. You can see the top line is fiscal 24. I know we're forecasting fiscal 24, 25, and 26, but as we learned from the last set of biennial estimates, if you miss the base year, you're going to miss the 25 and the 26. So I really tried to hone in on 24 and to get numbers that were right, so that I'd be on firm footing on the 25 and 26 estimates by having the base year correct. I'm calling for 4.7% on the control scenario, followed by 4.6 next year and 4.1 in 26. Not a lot of variation, but if you recall, some of those projection lines approached linear slopes. So that's kind of what you get. In terms of how this compares to the September number, the peach colored numbers are December. In the unfortunate blue color, it's unfortunate because it's not any real, I don't know, it's just a blue number. It's lower in all cases. So I am indeed calling for an upward revision to the sales tax. The year-to-date needs, I've already told you, we're 2.5 to hit the September estimate. The needs to hit the December estimate for the control that I just put up on the screen would be 3.9%. 3.9% to hit the control forecast that I put on the screen. The comparable growth from last year, so how high is the hurdle we have to jump over for the last 8 months of the year? 9.2%. So I need 3.9 over a 9.2 last year. But 9.2 last year, the whole year was over 10% last year, so it's not exactly the meat of the growth last year. It's just sort of typical months last year, but it was still a 9.2% growth. But we have expanded the base. And finally, I think finally, the projected differences from September, just in nominal terms, are listed right here. In all cases, they're higher. Regardless of the scenario you choose, you're going to get a higher number than September. And that's what I have for the sales tax. We now turn to the Gene Zaparanik Brown part of the presentation, and we'll go through major business taxes.
Thanks. Usually what I do is I just jump right in and talk about what has changed from the prior forecast. So in this case, I would just talk about what's different from September. But first, I want to go back and talk a little bit about the September forecast and why I revised it. I ended up revising it downward. So what happened, I ran my original forecast for December, and it was significantly lower compared to September. And I thought that was odd because the forecast for corporate profits was higher. It was significantly lower, approximately $130 million in the control scenario. So I went back and investigated what I had done. The first thing I thought was I had used a pessimistic forecast from S&P Global to do the December forecast. That wasn't the case. I was using the control. Then I thought, well, a lot of times I rename the variables, and I thought I'd rename the pessimistic to the control, and that wasn't the case. When in the September forecast, the first quarter was estimated, and now it was actual, so I wanted to compare that to see if there was any significant difference there, and there wasn't. Then I checked the data history and to see if it was corrupted in some way that was going to give me this significantly lower estimate, and that wasn't the case. So when I went back and I decided I needed to look at the September forecast to see what was happening there. As I had said, you could see the differences depending on the years were anywhere from 90 to 130 million, $13 million up to over 250 million in fiscal 26. So I really needed to see what was going on with the September estimate. Well, it turns out the September forecast was incorrectly estimated. There was serial correlation that wasn't correctly eliminated or completely eliminated. I think it was probably just an oversight on my part. I'm not sure exactly what happened. When I went back and fixed that, I got a lower September forecast. And so I think it's important to explain why I did that, because otherwise, as I said, we would have a significant decline relative to September, the current forecast relative to September when the profits forecast was higher. So it's a little small and difficult to see, but you can see the original September forecast in the top half and the revised estimate on the bottom half. So we went from 11 to 13% growth in the current year to 1 to 2% growth. So it's significantly lower. Again, it's approximately $130 million revision downward in the control. The growth rates on the out years are approximately the same. So at the time, 11 and 12% didn't seem like really high growth rates. While we hadn't collected a lot of the money, we were 88% over the prior year. Let's see. Let me go ahead and go with this. So this is the profits forecast. The blue is the December. The red is the September. And you can see that the forecast is higher now. It's approximately the same in 26, but significantly higher in the current fiscal year. These are the three scenarios: the control, the optimistic, and the pessimistic, where the optimistic is significantly higher than the other two, and the control and the pessimistic are approximately the same for both fiscal 25 and 26 before diverging, 24 and 25 before diverging in 26. So looking at the September and October receipts, we went from being up in August 88% to now we are at negative 4.6%. So what happened in those 2 months? Well, we fell 16%. And it's important when we look at the components of that decline that the declarations or estimated payments were the majority of that. That's important because the estimated payments are forward-looking, and the firms or the taxpayers will make adjustments based on what they think the tax liability is going to be at the end of the year. So because those were so much lower, that's an indication of that the 1 to 2% forecast that we're seeing now is going to be more accurate than the double-digit forecast we had seen in the September forecast. So didn't realize this was going to be so small. This is the forecast with the differences. So under the current year, we're looking at 4.5% to 5% for the three scenarios, almost no growth in 25, and 1.5% to 3% growth in 26, with a difference from the revised estimate of $30 to $40 million in the current year, a little bit less but still higher in 25 and lower in 26, but not by a significant amount. So I don't know if questions or comments or. So the property tax forecast is pretty straightforward. There's no change from September. We've talked about this quite a bit. Typically this time of year, we don't change it because this is not a model-driven forecast. When you look at the three largest components, the real, the tangible, and the public service, they account for nearly 75% of the total, mainly because the collection period is November through January. We are getting money in, but if you look at it real right now, it's, I don't remember what the number is, but it's not going to be in the range what we think it is. It might be, it can be 60% higher, 50% lower. So we're just not making any changes to that. So this is the forecast. You can see that last year property tax grew by 7%. It moderates over the next 3 years to 3% in fiscal 26, which is pretty standard. If you look at the last 20 years of just growth rates and average that, it's just right around 3%. Typically, there aren't large changes in the property tax. One of the largest we had in the last 20 years was fiscal 21 when we grew 9%, but that was a COVID impact where receipts were depressed in the prior year and grew. And so the 7% last year was the second highest in the last 20 years. So the forecast essentially just kind of moderates to long run average. That's property tax.
Seeing no questions, we're going to go ahead and do the remainder of the general fund. Cigarette tax, a small adjustment to the cigarette tax. You can see historically that it's really, cigarette revenues have really tapered off. 22 it was negative 7.3, 23 it was negative 7.8. Month to date or year to date through October, we were down 11.7%. I see no reason to interject positive momentum or a turnaround into this forecast, given the current environment in tobacco. So the forecast is a little bit down from what it was. I'm now calling for a 9% reduction in the current year, followed by an 8.3% reduction in 25 and a 7.1% reduction in 26. If this forecast does come to pass, an interesting factoid is that the 50-cent tax increase we did back in 2018 brought in roughly $138.3 million. We will compare before that tax increase, the receipts were $221 million. And the forecast calls for $231 million. So essentially all of the positive that was brought in from the tax increase that was effective 7/1/2018 will be essentially eroded by reduced tobacco consumption. So just minor change in the cigarette tax forecast. I've been saying for a couple of years I'm chasing it down. And maybe I am, but the receipts are very lumpy in the cigarette tax. I'll say that much. We've had some very lumpy negative months so far this fiscal year. We're due for a few lumpy positive months. It's a very consolidated market, so I'm expecting only 9%, despite year-to-date collections down more than 11%. Kentucky Lottery, we work very closely with the Kentucky Lottery executive staff to develop the forecast. Fiscal 23 was just an extraordinary year for the lottery dividend, growing $23 million to $370.3 million, largely due to a $2 billion Powerball, some other big jackpots that hit the multi-state draw games. I'll say fiscal 24 is off to a great start, trending ahead of pace and ahead of budgeted amounts. If you look at the highest 3 months of Kentucky Lottery, I'm sorry, 3 months. The 3 highest months of lottery sales history have been in the first 4 months of this fiscal year. The lottery is just taken off, and 2 product lines in general are just really shooting up. The iLottery, which is internet lottery products, are up 74.6% year to date, and up 27.4% compared to budget. And we've also exceeded expectations, greatly exceeded expectations on the multi-state draw games, Mega Millions and Powerball. The lone weakness, if you want to call it a weakness, is the scratch-off products that are only up 1.2% year to date, but they're down 5.6 compared to budget. I mention them because they're still roughly 50% of total lottery sales. If you look at their total sales, about half of it's still scratch-off. The reason I mentioned iLottery is they have the highest prize expense of any lottery game. So our prize expense year to date is up from 69.1 last year to 71.4% this year. So for every dollar wagered this year, we're paying 71.4% or 71.4 cents in prize expense. The fiscal 24 estimate is more or less a given. Since the budget language was very prescriptive, it said for that the estimate that you could have $3 million over the estimate of $340.6 million. So the official estimate for 24 is 343.6, since you get $3 million above the excess, and then the rest goes into an agency and trust account. And I'll show you the graph here in just a second, which is right now. You can see the blue lines are the general fund amounts of the lottery, and the red tails on each of the early years is the amount over the amount permitted by the budget to go into the general fund that goes into the agency and trust account. So in fiscal 24, we're calling for, last time we met, it was $14 million we were calling to go into that account. Now we're saying $21 million will go into that account. Small difference. General fund amount stays the same for the lottery forecast. We just think we're going to do a little bit better than the previous estimate, given the strength of sales to date. And this is just a reiteration of just the general fund lottery part, 337 and 23, and then, like I said, the 343.6 was from the last budget, and the 360 and the 370 don't have any budget bill language going with them because we don't have a budget bill that governs those years. So those are the full amount lottery estimates. Does anybody have any questions about the lottery? All right, the remaining part of the general fund is the 60 other miscellaneous accounts, both tax accounts and non-tax revenues that are classified in a bucket we call other. I showed this next bullet before, but insurance premium, alcohol taxes, telecom, inheritance, and abandoned property are the 5 largest traditional accounts. Parimutuel has already surpassed abandoned property. We've had good growth in parimutuel tax because of the proliferation of historical horse racing. Let me catch up in my notes for just a second here. Yeah, so the parimutuel forecast for 24 is 62.5, and the abandoned property estimate is 51.7. So parimutuel is now officially one of the top 5 largest accounts. That is until investment income on investments came to bear. Historically, in fiscal 23, or I'm sorry, in fiscal 21, it brought in a negative amount, negative $344,000. We grew to $500,000 in fiscal 22. Then last year it ballooned up to $150 million, and it's going to go higher, as I'll show you on the forecast on the next couple slides. But the biggest swing in other taxes and what's driving the revision I'm calling for in the other taxes is income on investments. I will say in terms of estimation techniques on a lot of these other taxes that we don't fit a lot of structural models. We obviously don't fit ARIMA and VAR models to the other accounts. They're estimated by a variety of sources, but not typically structural models, so we don't have an optimistic and pessimistic estimate for the other taxes. And we, since September, we adjusted approximately 12 of the accounts. It may be 13 or 11, but we adjusted some of the accounts based on current year-to-date receipts. I did say I'm going to focus on income on investments because that's where the swing has been. In fiscal 24, income on investments, which was negative just 2 years ago, is going to be 25% of other general fund tax receipts in the other category. 25% of $1 billion lump of revenues is going to be from investment income. And the dramatic increase obviously is tied to the deposits that were made into the state's rainy day fund. That fund is invested in a short-term pool that has benefited from the rate environment on short rates. Of course, income from investment has 2 parts, investable balances and rates. One of the differences between now and September is that we have a slightly higher rate forecast that is coming from S&P Global. Ultimately, the rate, I mean, we don't just take a rate like a 3-month T-bill rate from S&P Global and use it as a rate. The Office of Financial Management takes that as one of their inputs. They have very sophisticated models to figure out what we're going to get on our short-term pool, and they compute the rates, and the rate environment is better in this go-around than it was in September. And also, the investable balances have shown an improvement since September. This is a picture of one of the inputs that OFM takes in terms of short rates. One of the variables they ask for from S&P is the 3-month T-bill rate. You can see that in 24 it's sort of, I won't say peaks, but it's higher than 25 and 26. 5.5% in 24, followed by 4.4 and then 3.1. So obviously S&P Global is calling for a softer rate environment on short rates going forward. The this shows what the new forecast for income on investments is. We're calling for 289.1 in fiscal 24, 219 in 25, and 186.7 in 26. I put a little graph below the estimates so you can see how the December estimates compare to the September estimates. A lot of that difference is, again, the rate environment has changed. So you can see 289 is a full 25% of the other forecast, which I'll show you on the next slide. The other forecast. Big jump from 23 to 24 is obviously the income on investments. And then the reductions in 25 and 26 correspond to general growth in most of the other taxes. the 59 of the 60 accounts are muddling along, doing a little bit better, but the income on investments is doing a little bit worse, so you get a little bit less money in 25 and 26. But we estimate each of the 60 accounts separately. We do our best with them, and they have been adjusted for receipts through October. I didn't take into account November receipts yet. So that concludes, I believe, the general fund. I do have a few remarks about the general fund before I throw up the spreadsheets. I'll make these quick. Here is percentage growth, all scenarios. For 24, we're asking you to decide between 2.3 on the pessimistic side and 3.2% on the optimistic side. The control is 2.8. A little bit of a tight band in 24. But you've heard the economic assumptions. You can decide which ones make the most sense and so forth. The 25, the gap's a little bit different, a little bit greater. Negative 0.9 for the pessimistic and positive 0.9 for the optimistic, with the control being right around 0.2%. And then in 26, the gap gets even a little bit wider, 2.3% for the pessimistic, 3.5 for the optimistic, and 3.1 for the control. The general shape matches the general shape of the economy in terms of better growth in 24, a weak 25, and then a general rebound in 26. This is the implied variation among scenarios. Forgetting growth rates, looking at levels. The difference between the highest and lowest scenarios is 140.6 in 24, up to 610 million in 26. So that's while the growth rates don't seem all that different, $610 million is $610 million. So that's the nominal differences between scenarios. And I've already said what's driving the variation is the taxes with alternative scenarios, which are the individual sales, major business, and coal severance. Most of the other alternative scenario, there's no alternative scenarios for the rest of the general fund. So you're really talking about individual sales, major business, and coal, which is over 90% of the general fund when you take into account individual sales and major business taxes. So that's that. And with that, that concludes the general fund prepared remarks. And Mr. Chairman, at this time, we typically pull up a spreadsheet that is a summary of the general fund with the ability to do some different weightings if you choose to weight. I just out of habit put the initial toggle as 100% control. If you look down the spreadsheet that's in your packet, you can see that it's got the differences we're drawing is from 2023, the preliminary estimates, the statutory preliminary estimates, and then the differences are down at the very bottom. But I'll isolate the view to the upper pane so that we can hopefully reach a consensus on the official estimates for the general fund. And with that, we'll shut up.
Out of pure curiosity, could we see what like a 75 control and a 25 pessimistic looked like?
All right, get in your head the, well, let's just look at the 24 number, 15,565.6. So you want 75. $25, 15,602. So not a huge difference, but
No, I didn't think so. So it's actually,
what was the first number?
so it's 15. In my book, it's, am I right? In my book, it's 15,656.
Just a second. I think I've
15,
I think I've screwed up.
yeah, page 89. 15,
Is that right?
0.6.
Yeah,
Thank-
that something's not right there.
No, something's clearly wrong.
Okay. Good.
You put the 25% on optimistic rather than pessimistic.
Yeah, I was worried that I changed the order of the tabs, and when I copied the formulas, let me put it back to this 618.
was 2.4.
But 11.6 for fiscal 25 is not right.
I'm sorry, there's an error in this spreadsheet
Yeah.
in terms of the blending.
That's okay. Well, I kind of could. I was just hoping not to have to do that, you know?
I can compute it a different way, but my sheet is not performing well on the fly here.
Sorry.
No, it's not. Obviously, not your fault. It's a.
All my fault. Ask my wife. She'll tell you.
Do you think we're slightly less, or slightly pessimistic relative to control?
B6.
So, you know, if I had my druthers, I'd go with the control for fiscal year 24 and then a blend of control and pessimistic for fiscal year 25 and 26. But that's just me. And frankly, I don't want to do that math. So,
Was that a gut feeling, or do you?
no, I mean, if I I look at the stuff going, I mean, what it really comes back to is I look at the stuff going into the control scenario, and I believe the short run, but it's a little optimistic for the long run, right? I mean, in order to have the control scenario, you've got to have the Russia-Ukraine conflict kind of resolving itself somehow in the next year or so, and I'm just not sure I believe that.
Right, and the Middle East probably isn't
Yeah,
a big factor.
I
in
don't
this.
think it's a big factor in this. I mean, it could,
But
if it
it
really
prob-
intensifies, it could go into an oil problem.
Well, it could, but what I meant to say is I'm guessing the Middle East situation was not a factor in the putting together of global, whatever they call themselves now, S&P.
Yeah, S&P.
Yeah, because that was
Yeah.
pretty recent.
Well, I mean, they specifically mention. No, I guess they don't. Okay.
They do in the pessimistic.
Oh, in the optimistic scenario, cessation of active fighting and quick resolution.
right.
In the pessimistic, it's intensified.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the point is that in the fiscal year 24, there's not a lot of difference between the three scenarios. It's when we go out to 25 in particular that we start to see the bigger differences.
I think I see the problem with my formula.
It's not even that big a difference.
You might remember what we forecast last year. Did we forecast 3%? Or did we forecast more than? I remember 3%. For fiscal year 25. So we hit it on the nose?
We've been doing well with the growth rates.
Yeah, and I think that was a result of kind of this inflation issue, right? I've been
Yeah.
bullish on inflation for a while, and I kind of said in the past, if I remember right, I picked a more optimistic scenario, but not because I agree with the economics, but because it produced the highest revenue forecast. And I just thought inflation was going to be higher than what they were forecasting. And again, I mentioned one email I couldn't make last year is that I've always been a bit of a monetarist, and so when you look at where money supply growth was at, it would, in my mind, lead to inflation. That in fact occurred. Now, my concern now is M2 growth has gone the other direction, right? We're like negative 3% right now for the last 6 months or so, which is the other direction altogether. So that would tell me we're probably gonna have less inflation, but we're also in a world where it's kind of other potential implications when you have negative money supply growth, right? And so as I look at this, I come back to the individual components. I think the income tax is very difficult for all the reasons we heard. There's all these adjustments going on and tax law changes, et cetera. I just look at the sales tax, that's positive in a way, which we can argue about certain percentages, but that's, at the margin a little bit in my mind. So what I'm trying to get my head around is what scenario leads to an individual income tax that makes the most sense to me. I'm struggling with that a little bit, which is why I was asking some of the labor data around manufacturing and other things. So I'm a little bit I'm kind of comfortable on 24, 25 and is the one that's a wild card to me because that's really influenced by this decline in income taxes due to policy issues that are by definition hard to forecast. And then I'm at top of my mind also, I'm thinking, well, we got this negative money supply growth, which is going to start showing up in 25 and 26 at some point if that continues. So that's what's going through my head. I don't have an exact scenario for you, but that's what I'm wrestling with.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, sir.
I say if we can get the spreadsheet working, I would like to see the 15% optimistic, the 55% control, and the 30% pessimistic that was originally indicated by the National Outlook.
Okay, that's, I'm very close to getting this thing, fixed. The,
Greg,
yeah,
would you like to take like a 10-minute break?
I think I got the values correct, but the growth rates are not coming in correctly.
All right, the suggestion has been made that maybe while you're working on that, we move on to the road fund,
Yes, sir.
and then, yeah, excellent, yeah, yeah.
I can just talk
Right,
about
yeah.
what you want to do with this.
We only have one computer, unfortunately. It won't plug into here. Just a second. Let me try 55.
I can talk from the book.
Optimistic was 15. Pessimistic was 30.
So Chris, that gives you that out year downturn.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I believe these to be correct.
What if you give me back my 75?
Yeah, so that one's worse.
I think it's working. I'm sorry for that hiccup, but these numbers
Yeah, I think the optimistic and the pessimistic wash out some of those manufacturing numbers, and that's where I have concern of just going with one of them.
Thank you.
And most of the models saw a downturn in 25.
Right, and that's why I'm just coming back to the general question, just look at total dollars.
Yeah.
If you just say, do we really think fiscal year 25 dollars will be more or less than fiscal year 24? I'm just trying to figure out directionally, if we look at that, how do we feel about that direction? And then if we have a view on that, then maybe we figure out look at the scenarios that might lead to that. I don't know, I'm not trying to backsolve or something, but you know, we've had a challenge of under forecasting, to your point earlier, but yet we're moving into a little bit different world, I think, than we were dealing with in the last few years at a macro level, international level. And then you have on top of that this tax law issue on income taxes, which is a big driver.
Do you still have questions about, your main question is fiscal 25, you think that might be low?
If you look at just the control only, I'm looking at the book,
Yeah.
you know, basically it's flat, you know,
Yeah.
from year to year, 24 to 25, 0.2%.
Yeah, right.
This is flat, slightly lower.
Yeah.
And so almost any of these scenarios we pick, it's going to be roughly, well, if we like control in 24, my point is we got, how do we compare to 15,565 then? Well, you know, unless we're really pessimistic about a lot of things, then you're around this flattish plus or minus a little bit. And
Right. So, I mean, basically, I'm not
I mean, it's being driven by the change, right? The income tax change. So the individual income is being driven by economic factors and the tax change, which you fully feel in 25.
Right.
Everything else then is kind of a wash.
Yeah.
So
It doesn't surprise me that 25 could be slightly lower than 24 since you took a half point on, right? That's more than 10% on the income tax, which is half your
38%.
revenues.
I calculated it because it's about almost 40% of total revenue.
So, yeah, because that seems to be, if I remember the presentation right, that's where the full, to your point, the full effect gets phased in that fiscal year, which is why then 26 we get growth again, right?
Right.
So is it, like I said, I don't know if it's slightly flat or slightly high, slightly low, but I don't know that there's a big economic driver to this. It's more about the tax law accuracy, right?
I mean, so here's
the difference in the difference in in that and the control is really pretty small. I mean, that's within our normal forecast error, I think.
yeah. And the difference between Jose's just go with the global insight. And the difference between Jose's just go with the global insights and the control is also at least in fiscal 25 it was a 0% growth, and it was really close on the.
Do you want me to toggle back to that?
Yeah, would you? I mean, there's something to be
Optimistic.
said for, okay, if we believe all their other forecasts, why don't we believe the forecast on the percentages, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I gotta make this 55. There you go.
So do we believe we get to 16 in 26? Like that's really what's going on. I think we do, but maybe I'm too optimistic there.
Tell him to shut his mic off.
So 26 is going to change before 26.
Yeah, it's lower than the straight control. That part is true. I think we're always a little bit more risk averse, and that's why I think it's capturing. So if we do think there's going to be resolution to these two conflicts, then straight control will probably be a better estimate. But if we don't, and we also believe that there's going to be possible increasing labor union issues in the future, then this type of scenario might be a better estimate.
Well, and the other wild card, and obviously we get perhaps a chance to come back again, is, we have a national election next November, which could change a lot of things for at least 26, fiscal year 26, not so much 25, but I just think there's a lot of uncertainty right now.
Much will get passed next year.
Yeah.
Jobs numbers are still going up. It just came out this morning. It went, added 200,000 jobs.
Yeah, it was a little bit higher than
Mm-hmm.
Expectation.
Yeah.
So there's this predicted bounce back that they think is going to, I think is going to take longer than they expect. I don't think the Fed's going to be reeling interest rates down as quickly as they're suggesting. And the housing shortage is just going to continue for outside of this prediction window.
So what do we think? Do we think control? Probably not, but this blend?
Yeah, I can go with control, or I can go with this equal weighting, like what was just reflecting the broad range of possible futures, and it doesn't give you a lot of differences in the total dollars. So you said, okay, what's my $15 billion point? I guess I can go with this weighting here would be my vote, if you want to vote.
So this is
using the weightings that S&P had in their 3 scenarios.
Yeah. So I need new glasses prescription. What's the mix you have up there now?
Control 55, optimistic 15, pessimistic 30, which is the stated weights in the scenarios.
I'd second that. I'm fine. I mean, I assume Jose seconds it since he proposed it.
Yeah, I mean, I motion that we follow this.
Okay.
Or second.
Dr. Perry, what do you think?
I'm good with this.
Okay. And Chris, you've already weighed in, and
I'm good.
David, and all right. So I believe our official forecast is up on the screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Duly noted and saved. I'm going to write it out just in case.
Yeah.
Good idea, man.
And thanks for all your insights, because that was very useful.
So we're calling for 15,554.5 million in 24, 15,549.5 in 25, and over 16 billion in 26. Got it. Would you like to go to the road fund while we're... You want to head to the road fund? All right. Back to Gene Zapranic Brown. There you go.
Is it 9 or something? Okay. Thank you. So, summary of the changes from September. There aren't many changes. They're quite small. The control and the optimistic, fairly small, offsetting changes to the fuels and the usage. Significant decline in the pessimistic scenario for 25 and 26, which is related to the motor fuels change. And there's no change to the fiscal impacts that we presented in September. Across, at the bottom line, 6 million, 5.9 million in 24, and 12.3 million in 25 and 26. Looking at the differences, you can see that the control and optimistic are quite similar. All three actually in 24 with small increases. Declines in 25, and you can see that pessimistic is much larger, again, because of the change in the fuels. That's related to the tax rate. The only kind of head scratcher is under the control and the pessimistic in 26. The absolute value is approximately the same, but I expected to see the same sign. Not quite sure what the difference there is, but it's relatively trivial given the entirety of the road fund. So beginning with the motor fuels, there's really two important factors in forecasting these. The first is the tax rate, and then also the consumption on motor fuels. The tax rate's really important for several reasons. A, it changes annually, unlike most of the other tax rates that remain constant. And the value for each penny changed in the tax rate is significant. So the rule of thumb is for each 1 cent change in the motor fuels tax rate, it has approximately a $30 million impact on road fund revenues. And that's why you see such a large decline in the pessimistic forecast in 25 and 26. We'll see that there was approximately a 2 cent decline from September. The other is the consumption of motor fuels. That goes into the forecast, but it has a much less, the impact of changes in the consumption are much smaller on the revenues that we see. So looking first at the price of oil, the blue line is the December forecast. The red is the September. So you can see in the first year and a half of the 3 years, the December forecast is higher than it is lower. This is the control scenario. And I should mention, I focus really on the control scenario. We could see the optimistic and the pessimistic scenarios. They're all shaped very similarly, so I chose not to add graphs to this. And anytime there's a significant difference among the scenarios, I'll put up a graph. But because they're all essentially the same in terms of the December forecast is higher in the first half and lower in the second half of the forecasting period, I'm sticking strictly to the control scenario. Retail price of gasoline, this goes into estimating the average wholesale price. Of course, the current year, the rate is already set, but the December, you can see over the second half of 25 and 26 is lower than what we saw in September. These are all three scenarios. Again, the pessimistic is higher. We've talked about it before. And the control and the optimistic are nearly identical. December, or under this, yeah. So the motor fuels tax rate, of course, 24 has been set, so there's no change from September. Under the control in 25, the control and the optimistic are nearly identical. The pessimistic is twice as large at 2.1% lower, or 2.1 cents lower. And in 26, again, the control and the optimistic are very similar, 0.2 cents lower. And the pessimistic has a much larger decrease at 2.2 cents. This is the consumption on motor fuels. Again, the blue line is December, lower everywhere than we saw in September. So the changes in the motor fuels, almost no change in the current year under any of the scenarios. In fiscal 25, 21 and $18 million lower, much higher in the pessimistic, again because of the tax rate change is nearly twice as large. And then in 26, the control and the optimistic are similar in magnitude, different signs, and the pessimistic again is quite large at a reduction of $50 million. The motor vehicle usage tax, consumer spending on light vehicles is what we use. U.S. consumer spending on light vehicles is what I use to forecast that. Through October, the year-to-date receipts have grown 4.4%. The needs for the remainder of the year are only 0.5%, but the consumer spending on light vehicles are expected to decline over the second half of this year. Legislative impacts under this, same as last time, presented in September. So this is the consumer spending on light vehicles. December it is higher than we saw in September. This is what the current forecast of the three scenarios are for the December forecast. So the changes in the motor vehicle usage estimates, larger in the control and the optimistic in the current year, 12.9 million and 10.2 million. Similar again in 25, where the control and optimistic are very similar. The pessimistic's a little less, and in 26 they're all increasing, but approximately the same amount, $6.4 million, $2.3 million, and $4.1 million. Weight distance tax, it's forecast using the Industrial Production Index of durable goods. The control and the optimistic forecasts are lower, but the pessimistic is higher. Year-to-date receipts through August had grown by 0.3%. When we met and presented the September forecast, but through October they're now down 4%. So this is the Industrial Production Index on the durable goods, which I use. It is higher than we saw in September. The three scenarios, the pessimistic is much lower than the other two. They're somewhat similar. So the changes in the weight distance estimates are declines in all 3 years for the control and the optimistic, small increases in the pessimistic. Motor vehicle operators, this is an ARIMA, so there's only going to be one forecast for all scenarios. It's a stable revenue source. You don't get many changes in this. It's fairly stable except for special one-time events, whether it's the pandemic or tax rate change in fiscal '06 or the introduction of the Real ID, which increased the cost of the license and the length of the license. So the change in the forecast increase in the current year of $1.1 million, $1.5 million in '25, $1.4 million in fiscal '26. Motor vehicle license forecast we use using U.S. licensed vehicles, which are the cars and light trucks. From September, there is almost no change in that. The lines basically are on top of each other, so I didn't provide a graph of that. So the forecast really the change has to do with what's happened to receipts since the last meeting. In August, when we were here, the year-to-date receipts were up 17.3%. Through October, they are now down 6.5%. And the legislative impact, again, is the same as it was in September at $700,000 for all 3 years. Income on investments, much like the general fund, relies on cash balances and interest rates. However, the road fund investments are in the intermediate pool rather than the short-term pool, so there is a difference in the changes in the interest rates from the prior meeting. Cash balances are higher in the current year and next year, but they're lower in '26, and the interest rates are lower in '24, but higher in the next 2 years, which means the change in forecast for the investment portion for the current year will be a decline of $4.5 million relative to what we said in September, an increase of $1.5 million in '25, and a decline of $500,000 in fiscal '26. Then the other are a variety of fees and fines. Again, use an ARIMA model. So there's only going to be a single forecast for this. August year-to-date receipts were at 11.6%. Through October, they had fallen to 0.9%, which is going to reduce our forecast. Legislative impacts, again, are the same. So the change in the forecast for the current year is a decline of $400,000 in '24, $700,000 in '25, and $500,000 in '26. So putting it all together, the current year, the control forecast for the road fund, 7.4%, a decline of 2.5% in '25, and 3.6% increase in '26, with the optimistic and pessimistic the optimistic slightly higher and the pessimistic lower. That's the road fund quickly.
Any questions? I have a question.
Yes.
I don't see any reason why our blending would be any different on the road fund forecast than on the general fund forecast. What would it look like if we did the 55, 15, 25 blend on the road forecast?
55, 15, 30.
30.
Can you make that
Can you
just a
read
little
that?
bigger for me?
Pessimistic is off.
Why don't you hit it, Gene, because I don't.
You can read that? Kid. Get off my lawn! There we go.
Yeah, much better, thank you.
Thank you.
I tried for
It comes down to whether you believe you get over 19. Kind of like what we said about 16.
And others may have looked at this already, but the big difference in these cases is really all about motor vehicle usage.
Yep.
And so unless we have a strong view on auto sales. Right. And
And yet I'd point out that the difference, say, 61, 1678, talking about, you're talking about now on a base of 1800.
Not necessarily to Kentucky, it's
Well, the pessimistic scenario is 6.8. So, how low do you want to go? Are you more pessimistic than the pessimistic?
Well, of course, the current year is mainly a result of the fuels. If you recall, when the rate was frozen, so for the first 3 quarters of the year, we essentially have a 4-cent increase. I think it's 4.1 cent increase over the prior year, and then a 2 or 2.1 cent increase in the final quarter. So at 13.4% growth, we're at 16, I think, right now. So we're definitely on pace to hit the fuels. So we are going to have quite a lot of growth in the current year.
I like consistency. I like this.
Yeah. Jose, what do you think about this? John?
I'm good.
I like it.
Chris?
good.
Okay. I think that's our forecast, this blend.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We still have to do the tobacco master settlement agreement, if you have just a moment.
It'll be quite quick. The master settlement agreement, I have adjusted up the forecast to reflect the fact that we are, recall that the master settlement agreement has a floor. You can never have an inflation adjustment under 3%. It looks like we're going to be doing slightly better than that for the current year. I do have fiscal 25 and 26 using the 3% floor. So slight increase in the overall amount of the adjustment related to inflation. That results in a $103.1 million estimate for fiscal year 24. That is $500,000 more than what was presented last time. Fiscal year 25 is also increased by $500,000, and fiscal year 26 increases by $0.6 million. And overall, we are also continuing to settle past years that are being disputed, which of course helps the Commonwealth not have to defend questions about diligent enforcement in the past year. And as they have been settling those past years, that has allowed us to retain slightly more of the disputed amounts. So a slight increase in the estimates, but overall cigarette consumption is going down, and with the elimination of menthol cigarettes from the marketplace, we expect further declines in the overall sales rate.
Any questions? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Almost made it to 12 o'clock, so only 14 minutes passed.
Thank you, everyone. And so I hear a motion to adjourn here. Yeah, so, well, okay, we're adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very, and thank